My lecture today will deal with Ben-Gurion. I just finished a short biography of Ben-Gurion to be published in the series which I am one of the editors of, called Jewish Lives, and by Yale University Press. And this is, in a way, an excerpt from this biography, but not the same. Ben-Gurion died in December 1973. Israel was suffering the shock of the Yom Kippur War, mourning its fallen and fearful about the future. People paid scant attention to the passing of the founding father, the man who had taken Jewish history by storm and established the Jewish state. It was a low-key ending to a turbulent life story rich with expected and unexpected high points. Ben-Gurion chose to be buried not on Mount Herzl, the national mausoleum intended for leaders of the state where Theodor Herzl lies, but atop a high cliff overlooking Wadi Tzin and the Negev desert. He asked that his gravestone be inscribed with only the dates of his birth and death and the words "immigrated to the land of Israel in 1906, nothing more." Do his choice of burial place, not alongside the nation's great leaders, and the self-effacing inscription attest to humility in the face of death? Ben-Gurion was a man of simple manners, dressed simply and lived modestly, who was accessible to every man and woman, who corresponded with thousands of citizens and mingled with the public without fear or restraint. At the same time, he was fully aware of his wealth and knew his historical importance. But in Jewish tradition, there is an accepted titular hierarchy. Rabbi is higher than Rav, Rabban is higher than Rabbi. But highest of all is the one whose untitled name is sufficient, Gadol mirabban Shmo. Ben-Gurion chose for himself a unique commemorative site far from the national mausoleum, so that people would make a pilgrimage to his grave, and his alone. Non-mention of his deeds on the gravestone was intended to say his name is sufficient, and the rest will be told in the history of Israel. There are leaders regarding whom it was clear since their early youth that they were destined for greatness. This was not the case with Ben-Gurion. He was born in a remote town to a humble family which teetered between modest comfort and poverty, which trod the fine line between tradition and modernity, and could not afford to send its children to acquire a high school education. The start of Ben-Gurion's journeys into the big world was inauspicious. Unlike Dr. Theodor Herzl or Dr. Chaim Weizmann, who came from middle-class families, had a university degree, and acquired a profession that ensured their livelihood without having to be dependent on the Zionist organization, Ben-Gurion did not have a life outside politics. He did not study and had no profession. Before discovering political activity, he was a young man without a purpose. When he did discover it, during the first Russian Revolution of 1905, his life was suddenly given a direction, a purpose, and meaning. He would mention two books that directed him into the two major avenues of his life: Zionism and Socialism. The first Hebrew novel, Avraham Mapus' Ahavat Zion, Love of Zion, and Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin. It is difficult to ascertain whether this presentation of his conversion was late rationalization or actually reflected the reality. If the latter, it reflected the naivety of a small-town boy not exposed to the more sophisticated writings of either Zionism or socialism. He spoke Russian and read the great Russian novels, modern Hebrew literature and poetry, and admired poets Bialik and Chernyakhovsky. Yet he was always drawn more to philosophy. His great spiritual favorites were Spinoza, about whom he already lectured when he was 16 years old, and Plato. In the 1950s, he became deeply interested in Buddhism. He never acquired a formal education, but he read profusely. He had a passion for books on philosophy, history, Jewish studies, political thought. Israeli legations all over the world were busy locating for him and sending to him the books he asked for. When he passed away, he bequeathed to the state his library, which contained more than 18,000 volumes and many thousands of booklets. In 1950, in the midst of the mass immigration, when the country was when the country tottered on economic failure, he embarked on a costly cultural venture, microfilming Jewish manuscripts all over the world and bringing them to Israel. He called it the ingathering of the exiles of Jewish spirit. Despite all the difficulties, it was done, and this was the beginning of the Jewish People's Archive in Jerusalem. Soon he initiated a new ambitious project, translating all of humankind's spiritual treasures into Hebrew, from Europe, America, and Asia, which was done under the auspices of a very respectable committee in which Professor Martin Buber and Hugo Bergman took part. He always found time to participate in the meetings of this committee, but did not dictate its choices. He was fascinated by the idea of bringing into the new state all the finest products of humanity, and did not shy away when religious Jews reproached him for claiming that Israel has a lot to learn from non-Jewish thinkers. During his years in office, 4 new universities were built out of Israeli aid to this very day. And the 4 older institutions of higher learning were further developed, despite economic dire straits. His idea of Israel as a light unto the nations meant, among other things, the development of study and science. He did not feel inferior to the professors with whom he conducted an ongoing discussion on Plato, Spinoza, the Bible, Indian philosophy, ethics. Since the early days of statehood, he initiated an ongoing dialogue with Israel's leading scholars. He loved intellectual cut and thrust, and it seemed that sometimes he viewed it as a refuge from the monotony of political routine. On the other hand, he had scant respect for experts. They are experts on what had happened in the past, not on what will be in the future, he retorted when rejecting their recommendation. When a committee of experts determined that there was no possibility of building a modern city in Beersheba, and his chief of office asked him, "What are we going to do now?" "Well," he said, "we are going to have a new committee," he answered. Ben-Gurion was not born Ben-Gurion. He underwent a long apprenticeship before blazing his trail into public consciousness. First of the Jewish Yishuv in Palestine, then the Zionist World Organization, and only later of the entire world. During the period of Ottoman rule, despite being involved in Zionist socialist activity in Palestine, he did not leave his mark. It was after his return to Palestine from his exile in the United States during World War I that he began to gain prominence in his political activity when he was already in his middle 30s. He served as Secretary General of the Histadrut Labor Federation for 15 years. He was a militant workers' leader who did not flinch from confrontations with employers or rival workers' organizations, such as the rightist revisionist organization. During this period, he viewed the Histadrut as the Yeshuv's most important organization. It was always, wherever he was, this was the most important thing. The body that had undertaken the mission of building the country. He saw a complete match between the workers' interests, which mandated providing them with employment and a decent wage, and the Zionist interests. If the workers were not absorbed in the country, the Zionist foothold would not be established and the Jewish state would not come about, he contended. During this period, he was not averse to violent street clashes between members of the Histadrut and its adversaries on the right. In 1933, Ben-Gurion made one of the most important decisions of his life. He embarked on an election campaign with the aim of attaining hegemony in the Zionist movement for the workers. Two political streams were in the ascendancy, labor and the right-wing revisionists, led by Vladimir Jabotinsky. The question was, who would win the majority in the next Zionist Congress? It was against this backdrop that a dramatic election campaign was held in Poland, where there were millions of Jews, the largest source of potential voters to the Congress. It was there that for the first time, a characteristic of Ben-Gurion's mode of operation came to the fore. He identified the objective, defined the tools of achieving it, and then went into action with all the force he could muster. The objective, a workers' majority in the elections in Eastern Europe. The tools, enlisting the members of the youth movements, enthusiastic, energetic young volunteers, instead of the older and tired party activists. In addition, for 3 months, he crisscrossed Poland, Galicia, and the Baltic states, speaking in a different town each day, mostly in Yiddish, meeting with the young people, checking their list of shekel sales, urging, encouraging, reprimanding, and supporting them. In the end, he achieved 44% of the votes to the Congress, almost a majority. Thus began Labor's hegemony that lasted until 1977. That was a transitional moment in Ben-Gurion's career, from workers' leader to Zionist leader. he was still immature, still prepared to clash with the revisionists in the streets fight in Tel Aviv. But he was gradually exposed to the important things. He was elected chairman of the Jewish Agency's political department and discovered the world of diplomacy as he held talks with the British High Commissioner, Sir Arthur Walkup. Despite his long-winded speeches, which tried Walkup's patience, he impressed him. He attempted to negotiate with the Arabs of Palestine and was not discouraged by his failures. He was still sufficiently inexperienced to believe that if he were sincere and honest and offered the Arabs development, modernization, and parity in government, they would agree to Jewish immigration. But after 2 years of futile attempts, he realized that in the best case, they were prepared for the Jews to be a small minority in Palestine, whereas he was not prepared to relinquish the dream of a Jewish state. This, too, was part of Ben-Gurion's apprenticeship, understanding that he could not achieve everything he wanted. In 1937, a proposal to partition Palestine into a Jewish and Arab state was first tabled. The proposal came from the British Royal Commission of Inquiry, headed by Lord Peel, which visited Palestine in the wake of the Arab Revolt. It was the first time that a concrete proposal had been made regarding the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine. Small, but independent. Ben-Gurion viewed it as an extraordinary opportunity, a seminal moment in the long history of the Jewish people. In the end, the British abandoned the plan and adopted an anti-Zionist policy instead. But from that time, he saw the idea of partition as the right compromise with the Arabs, which would enable the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine. It seems that leaders have a time or mission predestined by history. Thus, for example, in the 1930s, Churchill was considered a failed leader who switched parties several times, was on the margins of political activity, and with his belligerent stance against Hitler, appeared to be a warmonger. Then the picture changed with the outbreak of the Second World War, and Churchill became perhaps the most admired leader of the 20th century. De Gaulle fulfilled a historic mission during World War II when he formed the Free French forces that fought the Vichy regime. After the war, he was sent into the political wilderness until he was called to save France from the Algerian War in 1958. But Ben-Gurion too had his moment in history. 1942 saw the beginning of the decade which I call Ben-Gurion's magnificent decade. In those years, he envisaged the establishment of the state and that it would involve war, prepared the tools to cope with this eventuality, directed the War of Independence, Israel's bitterest war, decided on mass immigration that within 3 years doubled Israel's population, and transferred the capital to Jerusalem, despite UN decision on internationalization. This is in addition to his decision to move Israel to the Western camp, to initiate reparation agreements with West Germany, etc., etc., etc. That decade began with his 1941 trip to the United States, where he arrived completely unknown. No one awaited him at the port, and an immigration officer could not comprehend why this Jew from Palestine had come to the United States, and he was detained for a few days. But a few months later, he already formulated the Zionist plan for action for the wartime period. The Zionist war objective was the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine. Enlisting American support was imperative. But the American State Department supported the British Foreign Office's anti-Zionist positions. While President Roosevelt was not anti-Zionist, he thought that Palestine was too small to solve the problem of millions of Jews. Ben-Gurion asserted that it was essential to change his position. And in order to do that, American Jewry had to be organized as a pressure group that would exert its influence on intellectuals, labor union leaders, and churches. Once public opinion supported the idea of a Jewish state, the president would be compelled to follow suit. And I quote, "The road to the White House passes through the American people," unquote. The question was how to do it. The Jews of America, which had recently entered the war following the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, were apprehensive lest the war be presented as a Jewish war and objected to any action that might hurt the president. They would change their position once the scope of the Holocaust became known. At this stage, Ben-Gurion's attempt to form a united front of American Jewry ended in failure. But the direction had been set out. The Biltmore Conference of America's Zionists in April 1942 declared that the Jewish people's war objective was the establishment of a state in Palestine. For Ben-Gurion, this constituted a plan of action. No one knew when the Jewish state would be established. The British were determined to keep their anti-Zionist policy, and after the war, with the rise of the Labour Party to power, they even hardened this line. Nevertheless, Ben-Gurion was convinced that the state would be established soon, and its establishment would involve war with the Arabs. In the summer of 1945, while the war with Japan still went on, he took a step which he later viewed as one of the three most important things he had done in his life. The other two were his immigration to Palestine in 1906 and the Declaration of Independence. In New York, he convened a meeting of several dozens wealthy Jews from all over America and explained to them that a Jewish state would indeed be established soon and that a war would ensue, not only against local Arabs, but against the Arab states. At that time, neither the Arabs nor the Jews imagined that the British would leave Palestine, not to mention an invasion by the Arab states. The Jews could win, he declared, but they needed arms. In America, the sale of military surplus for scrap had begun, and equipment for military industry in Palestine could be purchased at a very low price. Ben-Gurion asked those present to set up a special fund for this procurement. All those present agreed, and the Sonborn Foundation, named after the man in whose home the meeting was held, was created. The machines were purchased and shipped to Palestine, dismantled and camouflaged as spare parts and agricultural machinery, and then reassembled. This machinery was the foundation stone of Israeli military industries. After the Second World War, the Jewish people was at its nadir. 6 million Jews had perished. In Palestine, the British ruled with an iron fist and prevented Jewish refugees from entering the country. But Ben-Gurion identified its strong points: the Yishuv, which was prepared to fight the British; the Jewish community in America, which would exert political pressure on the president; and the Jewish refugees in the displaced person camps in Germany, who would not allow the problem to be removed from the international agenda. He activated 3 channels of action. In Palestine, the Jewish resistance movement was formed, which sabotaged British facilities in order to demonstrate that they would be unable to rule without an agreement with the Jews. In America, Rabbi Abba Hillel Silver from Cincinnati turned the Jewish minority into an ethnic pressure group whose weight began to be felt in American politics. And in Germany, Ben-Gurion visited the DP camps, the only Jewish leader to do so, where he met with the Jewish refugees, raised their spirits, and assured them that they would soon emigrate to Palestine. The illegal immigration he organized, which the British tried to halt, kept the subject on the international agenda, much to the frustration of the British, who hoped that the refugees would despair and return to the bloodlands in Eastern Europe. These 3 pressures led the British to take the decision on Palestine to the United Nations, and the rest is history. It seems to us today that the decision on the establishment of the state on the 14th of May 1948 was self-evident, but that was not how it seemed at the time. Taking such a decision, when U.S. Secretary of State General Marshall cautions the Jew against defeating the war, when the Haganah Chief of Staff is reporting that the chances of victory are no more than 50-50, and while the Americans are demanding that the decision be postponed for a few months, was not an easy thing. It was only Ben-Gurion's powers of persuasion that led to a 6-4 majority in the provisional government in favor of independence. The decision was carried by 1 vote only. 3 years after the end of the World War, after the Holocaust, he took a gamble on the great hope of the Jewish people, the state. He was fully aware of the risk. He was very apprehensive. But as Golda Meir said, he was capable of making difficult decisions, not because he was not afraid, but despite his being afraid. Could anyone else have made a decision that meant sending thousands of young men to their death? There had been no precedent for this in Jewish history since the Bar Kokhba revolt in the 2nd century. And now there is a state. How does one educate a nation that for 2,000 years had not had political rule to accept authority and majority rule? Ben-Gurion was very apprehensive of the Jewish people's anarchistic inclinations, its tendency toward dissension on hair splitting, its lack of governmental tradition. It was against this backdrop that the Altalena affair erupted, the Etzel arms vessel that Ben-Gurion ordered to be sunk because he viewed it as a challenge to the army's authority, the authority of the state. This decision drew sharp criticism. How could Jews fight against Jews? But it also set out ground rules that were fully observed throughout Ben-Gurion's terms of office. In recent decades, we have witnessed in Israel minority groups challenging the authority of the state, sometimes successfully. Fortunately, Ben-Gurion's statist legacy still holds firm and is accepted by one and all. On the eve of the establishment of the state, in order to grant broad public legitimacy to the nascent state, he formulated the status quo agreement with the religious parties, giving them authority over marital laws, and he even spoke of preserving the Jewish character of the state in the public sphere. He believed that the ultra-Orthodox would soon disappear, which, did not happen. Nevertheless, this about prophecies. Nevertheless, he scrupulously avoided a total crisis with the religious circles. He crossed swords ideologically with religious politicians and intellectuals, but avoided rupture. During the nation's formative period, he explained, it was crucial to avoid schism among the people. Ben-Gurion viewed the 1949 borders as sufficient territory for the absorbing of all the Jews desiring to come to Israel. He rejected proposals from young generals to extend the country's borders. We don't need more territory, he stated. We need more Jews. He adhered to this view even after the Six-Day War in 1967, when he stated that all the occupied territories, with the exception of Jerusalem and the Golan Heights, should be returned in exchange for peace. Despite his disparaging remarks about the United Nations, he said, shmum, he was extremely attentive to world opinion and throughout his life sought a close relationship with the great democratic power, the United States. But America of the 1950s turned its back to the young state, refusing to supply it with arms or give it international support. To his dying day, Ben-Gurion was never an official White House guest. The state's early years were years of revolution. Within 3 years, as I said, the population doubled in size and had to be provided with housing, work, and education. The mission of forming a nation out of people from dozens of countries who spoke different languages and who came from a wide range of traditions and cultures was, in Ben-Gurion's eyes, a mission of paramount importance, the true Zionist revolution. But unlike political objectives, which he not only knew how to define, but also to find the levers for their attainment, the objective of forming a nation was more elusive and harder to implement. His attempts in this direction did not gain success to the degree he hoped for. He was not prepared to listen to his advisors, who demanded that immigration be restricted, since the state was unable to shoulder the burden of immigrant absorption. He was also not prepared to hear about selection. Every Jew, he held, can be educated and reach the same cultural level as the veteran members of the issue. But he was impatient and did not understand that cultural integration takes longer than forming an army or directing a war. In the end, Ben-Gurion was disappointed with the state he had founded. the chosen people, or a light unto the nations, the slogan he used to voice, did not express reality, but rather an aspiration toward betterment of the society and state and the creation of a utopian society. It is yet to come into being. Ben-Gurion used to say that he did not do what the people wanted, but what he thought they needed. This was paternalism, which drew criticism at the time and certainly would today. But it reflected his willingness to take responsibility and make difficult decisions, which in retrospect proved correct. Golda Meir said, "Every time I opposed him, it turned out in the end that he was right." He possessed a sense of historic opportunity that guided him through his most difficult times. And first and foremost, he had the courage to take calculated risks. Ben-Gurion held that history is not made by leaders, but by the masses, by spontaneous processes. But he would add, at fateful moments, a courageous, resolute leader capable of making hard decisions makes the difference between victory and defeat. He was referring to Churchill, but by the same token, his words are true of himself. Would Ben-Gurion have been able to cope with the complex reality of 21st century, of an open, almost anarchic society with a variety of diffused foci of authority? Would he have succeeded in dealing with the present-day media, or would the bloggers joke at the slogan he liked to voice, which were indeed pompous if one did not believe in his sincerity, and they would, within a few days, shatter his authority? After the establishment of the state, the aura of the founding father, the victor of the War of Independence, accorded him almost messianic status among the new immigrants. But even then, members of his own party and of the opposition had no qualms about undermining his authority, and in the end caused his exit from the political stage, just like the fate of Churchill and de Gaulle. But he bequeathed to the state of Israel and the Jewish people a model of a leader who combined political wisdom with military daring, caution with the ability to make difficult decisions, responsibility for shaping a nation and national culture. When the Camp David negotiations in 2000 between Ehud Barak and Yasser Arafat collapsed, one of the Palestinians remarked, "We need a Ben-Gurion, but we have got Arafat." At present, in a time of leadership that shies away from making decisions and submits to pressure, a leadership that every day examines its image in the public opinion polls that change with the latest TV news, we yearn for Ben-Gurion. Thank you. Sure.
Hey, Mark, you want to take your questions that come up? We are moderator here. Questions
Thank you for the wonderful presentation.
Okay.
One of the leaders who's generally cast in contrast to Ben-Gurion is Menachem Begin.
Yes.
I was wondering if you could reflect a little bit on Ben-Gurion's relationship to Menachem Begin. And how I know it's not a small topic, but
Okay, I try to do so. Ben-Gurion involved Begin for many years. Begin, for him, represented to state authority because of the former relationship with Etzel and the revisionist Magdalena. And later on, Ben-Gurion made it a point to delegitimize the Herut party headed by Begin. Begin, I think, since I would say the late 40s, admired Ben-Gurion. This does not mean that he did not challenge him. Now, on the eve of the Six-Day War, Begin went to meet secretly with Ben-Gurion and offered him to come back to be prime minister. Ben-Gurion was retired since 1963. This started a new phase in their relationship. Suddenly, Ben-Gurion became much more friendly with Begin, and he even commented on it that his wife, Ben-Gurion's wife, Paula, always regarded Begin with admiration, and she liked him all the time. And as we know, Paula was a better judge of people than Ben-Gurion. So anyway, Ben-Gurion since then became friendly with Begin, and all the relationship changed. I would say that as time went on, the memory of Ben-Gurion became admired by all the camps in Israeli society. And today, the right-wingers and the left-wingers both converge in admiration of Ben-Gurion. And last year, there was the year in which the Ministry of Education promoted the theme of leadership. And the two leaders about whom every school had to study were Ben-Gurion and Begin. Yes.
So I think we're like, Israel in general is obviously on a path towards like liberalization in terms of its economy. How do you think Ben-Gurion would have responded or thought about sort of the technological innovations and how that correlates with, maybe does it diminish or undermine the Jewish state which he thought so highly?
I think that he would have welcomed technological advancement. On the other hand, he was apprehensive of the modern media. The fact that he did his best to prevent the entry of television to Israel shows that he was against mass media and he was afraid of it. I don't know how he would have coped with this eventuality. It's a completely different world today. On the other hand, he has got something in his personality that I believe would have come through very well on television. This great head, the mass of hair, and this metallic voice. It's something that would have caught people's imagination. So I don't know.
What was the source of Ben-Gurion's fascination with the Negev?
Well, first of all, it was very simple. Since the 1930s, the Jews were looking for places to settle. And there was a famous trip of Zionist labor and non-labor leadership that went on a tour of the Negev, and they got up to Eilat. And they believed that maybe they'll find water there and abilities to settle there, because they thought that this was the big potential of the country. To this day, the Negev is half of the state. So Ben-Gurion hoped that this would generate a new energy within the people and caused to a new pioneering effort after the establishment of the state, and that's why he went to Sde Boker, to settle there. He hoped that his example would draw young people after him. It did not work out. Yes, please.
One of the issues in the early years of the state was the absorption of so many Sephardic Jews who came from such a different cultural background. And there are many criticisms that are made that the Ashkenazic leadership just didn't understand them, try to transform them. Would you have something to say about how Ben Gurion understood this or didn't understand this issue?
He understood and did not understand, of course. I would say, basically, he claimed that all, as I said, that all Jews are of the same level of cultural ability. They only need to be brought up under the same circumstances. However, he could not provide the same circumstances to all the households in Israel in those years, which were, just imagine, absorbing within a few years twice the size of American population in this country. Just imagine. It was a gigantic effort, really a gigantic effort, and he knew it theoretically, but practically he didn't know how to cope with it. And I think this was one of his points of weakness, that he thought that he did understand the problem. He lived very much under the shadow of the destruction of European Jewry. He felt that a state was created, he once said. Never I imagined, the Jewish people prayed for so many generations for a Jewish state. But no one I imagined, and he formulated it, when will a state be formed for the Jewish people? They never imagined that when the state is formed, we would ask the question, where will a people be found for the state? And it was a tragic situation. He understood the complexity, but he did not know, nobody knows, how to cope with it.
Any other questions? Okay, well, then let's thank the speaker. Oh, you have a question? Thank you, Anita. This was really wonderful.
I feel as if David Ben-Gurion is right in the room.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.